Great. Okay. Well, my screens have gone down, so hopefully you can see me. Sorry about the lighting if it's bad.
Yeah, we can see.
Good. Okay. There's intentionally more slides than I'll even talk about today, but I'll describe this as we go along. But this is work done for NICE on can we model, so this isn't a simple model by any means, can we model the cost effectiveness of SARS-CoV-2 point of care tests? Firstly in a hospital setting, but then I come on to nursing home setting as well. So it's an extreme form of early economic modelling. So the test didn't even exist when we did this work. The main thing is, could we have a structure in place so that when the tests were known, the prices were known, more data was available, we could plug in the data and run. So it's almost building the architecture in advance. It's on SC2 point of care tests, with the key advantage being the turnaround time. We discussed the hospital setting at a NICE diagnostic committee. That was back in October 2020, but there's no guidance out yet. Presumably that relates to the fact there were no tests that were formally being appraised. The full publication's out in the Health Technology Assessment monograph. And I'll talk you through the main results as we go. What the MRHA had done, though, is to set up these target product profiles. So they said, this is what a desirable test should have in the way of characteristics. So your diagnostic accuracy, so your sensitivity, specificity, and your turnaround time. There were also some data out there from being real world use. They were also factored into this assessment. And the main thing was to give an indication to the MRHA and to NICE of how good the desirable and acceptable TPPs were. I mean, they've done all of this guessing. They haven't built a model, it's just their best guess. So if the model was accepted by NICE, we could run and look at any test very quickly. What I'm going to show you, and this is why there's so many slides, there's the lead team modelling presentation. So at the diagnostics committee, you'll have a clinical talk about the tests, how they work and so on. Then you'll have a modelling talk, which is obviously where I'm focused. So I put all the slides in, but I'm going to run through a lot of them. So the results, they don't really matter because we know the parameters will change, but the key conclusions will be important. You know, obviously things like the better diagnostic accuracy, the better results you'll get. These will all come through, but also the methods. And we'll see some of it gets a bit advanced, but I've tried not to delve too deep into that. So because it was advanced, it's an individual patient model. It was done in Simulate, which might be a package that few of you are familiar with. So NICE don't normally allow it, but I undertook the work on the almost condition that I could use this package. And then because I made a really good start on it, NICE saw that I made a really good start and then told me I had 2 months less for the deadline, which was not the best way to send my summer of 2020. But because it was important, you have to obviously take these things on the chin. So here's the start of the slides from NICE. As I said, I'm not going to go through them. They're there for reference. They can be shared, etc. So this is a model structure, and this is the simplified model structure. So we've got patients arrive at A&E. So this is a mixed bag of patients. Some might have appendicitis, some might have sepsis, some might have broken legs, and some might be suffering with COVID. But they all bundle up at the front door of A&E. Then they all sit around while you wait for a decision on whether they get admitted into hospital. So the serious patients, assuming there's capacity, enter the hospital, with the others being told to go and rest at home. But of course, in this position, while everyone's milling around the A&E rooms, people could be infecting one another. So this waiting for a decision on admission is a key infection point within the system. So that's been modelled. Then you can see the green one is the patients being told, you know, go home, you're not going to be admitted to hospital. Whereas the blue one are the patients who know you're going to be admitted, and then it's the case of the hospital trying to find which ward they should go into. Now, those wards were going to be split up. So we did a lot of talk with experts in the systems. Those were almost going to be made into COVID and non-COVID wards. So there's two mistakes you can make here. One is you can put a COVID patient in a non-COVID ward, which obviously allows the spread to run rife, potentially. Or you could stick a patient without COVID in a COVID ward, which will have less implications apart from that one particular patient. But while they're waiting for the decision, they're also going to be triaged into those with COVID symptoms and those without COVID symptoms. And again, you can make the same error and people can be infecting one another in these waiting for where you're going to end up place. Once they do end up in hospital, then it becomes a bit easier. They either get well and go home. Unfortunately, they might die in this simulation, or they could go into ICU and they can bounce back from ICU into a ward or to death. Now, the key thing is how many times we'll be testing for SARS-CoV-2 within this model. So we test when they're decided that they're going to be admitted. So it's not everyone coming through the door. That's something that was built in, but NICE didn't want us to pursue it. So you test once they're waiting for the decision, then you test once they're actually in the wards. If they're believed to be non-COVID, then you'd still be doing weekly tests just to see whether they've been infected at any of these infection points. And also we started looking at surveillance of asymptomatic staff, because there is this feedback loop that the staff could get infected by a patient who then the staff go and treat other patients and they get infected and so on. So there's lots of potential feedback within this model. So what we did, so some of these numbers, they're there, like we're assuming 250 people a day, time horizon of 90 days. I don't want to get into all the specifics. I'm only going to talk in broad generals. But essentially, we divided patients turning up to A&E into 4 groups, and they're the 2-by-2 combinations of whether you're going to end up needing hospital admission and whether or not you have COVID, well, SARS-CoV-2. So what you can see is that of the 100 patients, 3.53 would have SARS-CoV-2 and would enter hospital. Another 1.8 would be potentially sneezing on people before they got discharged. We did do lots of sensitivities, almost everything in the model we did sensitivity around, but that was one where we looked at increasing the spread. Okay. So I've talked a bit through this to hopefully make this slide easier, is that when they're awaiting their decision on to admit or not, they either get discharged or they're admitted, but then they're split into these bays while they're waiting for their SARS-CoV-2 tests. Those who end up with, who look like they have clinical symptoms of COVID-19, but of course that could just be pneumonia, flu, a really bad cold, etc., or those with no clinical symptoms. Now, because patients can have SARS-CoV-2 but be asymptomatic, there's obviously a chance that you'll have people with SARS-CoV-2 sat around with loads of other people without the disease. So the hospital layout, so this is why it was hard to give blanket solutions. Every hospital is different. There's some really new builds that are great, and there's older historic ones that have less room. What we did was set up different configurations of hospitals, and where there were single occupant bays, so a nice room for a single person, we would put patients with symptoms of COVID into a single occupancy bay to restrict spread. The others were in a bay of 4 people. And if you ran out of single bays for the ones with COVID, they were also in 4 bays. Where we ran into problems, and this was a simplification within the model, is we didn't want to look at shipping patients between hospitals. So what we did was have an infinite ward. So there were 4 wards of 4 beds, there were 4 of singles, but then there was an infinite that was using the car parks, using trolleys in the corridors, etc. So this was just there. So one of the things that come out of this model, because it's individual patient and it's got quite a lot of features within it, we could look at capacity usage as well, and there's slides on that. So patients in the single rooms can't infect other patients, but they could via a member of staff. So these were the tests that we were looking at. So these were done by MRHA and from real world. So from the real world data, if you're always waiting for a lab test, the actual time to result looked massive. It looked 36 hours. We did test 6 hours for like big teaching hospitals with their own labs and other times as well. But the lab tests were assumed to have this diagnostic accuracy. So 89% for symptomatic patients. These tests at the time were shown to be less sensitive in asymptomatic, so there's a decrease there, and very high specificity for the lab tests. For the point of care, you've got the desirable and the acceptable. So the desirable is way better than the acceptable. It's quicker and it's got better accuracy. Then what you've also got is the currently available tests. So these were tests that have been rolled out from publications, the data that we had. So these are what we were actually going to model on. Chest imaging also comes into play as well, you'll see. So remember, we've got these two groups. We've got the ones who come in coughing and sneezing and feeling very unwell, and we've got people with other symptoms that don't look like it's COVID. Starting with that second group, they have a test. If it comes back positive, they're going to be told you're going in a SARS-CoV-2 ward or a bay. The negatives go into the non-SARS-CoV-2 bays. So that one's simple. You're doing it basically on the test alone. With the ones who are displaying symptoms, clinicians were not willing to take a chance on a false negative. The positives all just got fed through straight into SARS-CoV-2. The negatives, the clinicians were worried about putting somebody with SARS-CoV-2 into a completely susceptible ward. So they'd repeat it, and if it was positive, they'd say, good, we've missed a bullet there, you know, we dodged it, put them in a SARS-CoV-2 area. If it was negative, they still wouldn't trust the tests. So this gives you an indication of where clinical perception was at this time. They would then do chest imaging. And if that was suggestive of COVID, they would put them in a SARS-CoV-2 area. So they're being very, very risk averse here. Anyone with clinical symptoms is likely, unless they get two negative tests and no chest imaging, they're going to end up in a SARS-CoV-2 area, which of course is bad for the patient who doesn't have SARS-CoV-2, but just has flu. So the times were set up to take everything into account, and we did sensitivity on them because we couldn't really trust these info. And as time progresses, things are likely to get better as well. And we did lots of sensitivity analyses. The only thing to tell you on this slide is the model was even more complicated than I've already told you about, because we did build in things such as pink wards, which was almost a quarantine zone in between the SARS-CoV-2 and the non-SARS-CoV-2 bays. So there's lots of things in there that I'm not going to talk to you about. So of those that were admitted to hospital with SARS-CoV-2, the vast proportion did have symptoms, though. You're looking at 96%. But what about those where they did have symptoms, but they then didn't have SARS-CoV-2? Actually, we looked at the data, which was suggesting 28%, but we bumped it up because we knew the flu season was potentially coming. So in the model, I'd increased this arbitrarily to 50%. We've used data sources all from the public domain at the time about the probability of going into ICU and the probability of dying, which all at least have face validity. I'm not going to go into the actual numbers. Same with the death rates. They come from public sources and the numbers. So it was about 1 in 11 patients who were infected on a non-ICU ward that would end up in either ICU or die. So these were the figures we were running with at the time. So as well as the patients, so the patients are fairly easy. They're linear. They walk in the door, either get shoved out the door or admitted to hospital via one of the bays, then they eventually leave. They're linear. The staff are a bit more complicated because staff move around different patients, different bays, and so on. So you've got to be able to model it to catch this feedback loop and potentially other sources of infection. So the hospital staffs could pick up the disease and then infect other people. Though if they had symptoms, they wouldn't be allowed into work. They'd just be removed from the model. But we did also use exogenous shock. So you could be infected from outside the hospital. That risk, once we hit peak pandemic, was way lower than what was actually happening. But that 0.6 per 10,000 people was the prevalence at the time we did the work. We also built in, should you do asymptomatic testing of staff, so you'll see results with and without. The advantage of the asymptomatic testing is that you might pick up people before they got to infectious. We'll look at the disease progression in a minute, and potentially remove a seed of infection from the model. So here's the spread of the model, the spread of the infection within the model. So it comes, start looking at the bottom table to begin with, so this purpley one. These are all data that was available to us summer last year. So it was thought that the time, so your lead time from infection to infectiousness, so your incubation period was about 3.5 days. And then it took another 2 and a bit days before you developed symptoms. So actually asymptomatic tests could pick you up in the region of 5 to 6 days quicker. And then eventually you become non-infectious, and that was about a week. For other runs, we changed this as data increased, and we got more accurate estimates. Now, the problem with all of these individual models and all the moving parts is that you could end up with a range from next to no one getting infected to almost everyone getting infected. If we had a source of data that was historic and that modeled the system, that helps us no end. And that's what we have with this Carter data. It said that 8.7% of infections within hospital were actually iatrogenic, so they were hospital acquired. So we now set up the model, we calibrated it so that we ended up with 8.7% of infections as being from within the hospital setting. So now, I can't remember exactly which ones we allowed to move and which ones were dependent on the others, but all of the models that we ran should now end up with this 8.7%, so that when we brought in the new testing, we could see exactly what was happening. We'd have a bit more confidence in the results. But again, and sorry if some of you aren't modelers, in an individual patient model with infectious disease flow, you need to run different random number streams throughout the model, or else you might just find that just completely by chance, no one comes in who's infectious, which obviously is entirely unrealistic a scenario. It might happen in one hospital, but not every hospital in the UK. So this is just showing you that I did some validations, and I ended up running 50 random number streams because that looked like the number of infections across all of these runs weren't changing. So there are these things built in. So this is why the modeling becomes a bit more complicated, and why I actually needed to use this bespoke package, because it's actually very user friendly. So if I make a mistake, I can spot it quickly. So what's the upshot? Why are we doing all of this anyway? Because we could end up killing people from SARS-CoV-2 infection. And that's what we're wanting to avoid. So we could have just stopped at infections avoided, which we pull out of the model anyway. But because NICE works on this cost per QALY threshold, we need to look at the number of QALYs lost through a death. So when the model ran, so when the individual patient model ran, we tagged those who were simulated to die and looked at the number of QALYs that they would have lost based on average life expectancy, based on utility, and saying if they'd been into ICU, they'd be worse off. We took that from sepsis because obviously there weren't much data around. But the problem is if in one model I killed a 30-year-old and in the other model I killed an 80-year-old, the QALYs lost is drastically different, despite it just being the chance of the random numbers. So we then had to fit, this was a fairly simple linear regression, through the number of infections through each scenario and the QALYs lost. So you can see there's quite a bit of jitter around this. There's noise, Monte Carlo sampling error. But when we came to run it, we needed averages. So we just ran with this. The number of QALYs lost was picked up through this line. For the nursing care, we ended up fixing it so it was at 0 and 0 as well, and using a logarithmic or something. But because I was in panic mode around this stage, a linear regression would do. So heading on to important things like the testing strategies. What we've got here are 10. There's actually more, but these are the first 10. So the way this is set up, if you ever want to revise this, and these are all in the HTA monograph, you have, so it starts off with no real testing, but we can, lab testing only on those walking through the door. So L is lab testing, which has the long delay. P is point of care testing, so much quicker but less accurate potentially. And N means we're not testing. So we've got all of these different scenarios set up based on whether it's point of care, no point of care, and this doubly bit was what we did with a negative test. These were nice slides, so I didn't actually do it. They shouldn't really have been in there. These are, when I put new slides, this is just to help you rather than these being in the nice committee. So the regression analysis, the random streams didn't make it into the nice presentation. These are other scenarios that we ran. So we ended up running 30, but these were saying as strategy 2, but now let's say it's 24 hours for your lab test or 6 hours. And then we looked at acceptable TPPs, real life data, and lots of other things. So it's hard for me to gauge this, but I've gone through that in what I felt was an appropriate time, leaving time for questions. The results, I'm going to concentrate on less the actual numbers, but it's only the broad messages that came out. So these are, NICE did this, I thought was really helpful. These are the strategies up there. 1 to 5 didn't have staff testing. That's the only difference between 1 to 5 and 6 to 10. But what you see is these are the terms of the cost of the strategies, and these are the QALYs gained. So the QALYs gained was just an arbitrary number, 50 minus your QALYs lost, just to put it in a normal format for those who aren't experts but have moderate knowledge of cost effectiveness. So what we see is actually the test only those on lab isn't very good. There's a lot more QALYs being lost, although it is the cheapest scenario. If you move to number 4, which is point of care on admission and on retest, it's actually more expensive because of all the costs you're running of the tests, and you can see those in red at the bottom. But actually you're gaining more QALYs. So you're gaining 5.5 more QALYs at a cost of about 75 grand, which means that an ISA, so the ISA is the cost per QALY, is about 13,500. So when NICE, pre-pandemic, when NICE were fully opportunity cost focused, anything above 30,000, unless in rare circumstances, would not be thought good value for money. So here, moving to S3, using a point of care for the weekly test in asymptomatic patients wasn't seen to be a good use of money after you'd originally used point of care for admission. So those are the results. This is the expected number of infections. So exactly as you'd imagine, the ones that do point of care straight away with a fairly accurate point of care, because this is your desirable product profile, they end up with less infections. If you use the point of care in the asymptomatic ward round, there's slightly less infections, but it's not worth the extra money because point of care tests were assumed to be more expensive. What we did find, just have a little look at this table, really, the one, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the table at the bottom. What you find is, and it's no surprise, the time it takes you to turn around a lab-based test totally affects the cost effectiveness of point of care tests. In fact, if you're at a super duper hospital with a lab next door and you could turn it around in 4 hours, then you are always better to use your lab-based test because of its higher diagnostic accuracy. However, if you're out at this 36-hour range, then what you can see, even if the point of care turned you around in 3.8 hours, the ISA is 21,000. So that would be cost effective. The 3.8 hours was what real world testing suggested for point of care. So that's from the clinician ordering it, saying test this patient, to it coming back with everything else in the in-between. So timing makes a massive difference. So, you know, your actual optimal strategy differs on your hospital. What about testing asymptomatic staff? It brought down the number of infections. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this. It brought down the number of infections, and it did look like it could be cost effective in most scenarios. I'm going to skip over because this one's far more important slide, I think, just for general interest. So this is the package that I could do, that I use, could spit out capacity and resource uses. So what we have here, these 4 graphs are all to do with using point of care tests, and they change based on the time to turn around that point of care. So it goes from 30 minutes on the left through to 6 hours on the right. And if you could turn people around in 30 minutes, these holding pens, so these are people who have clinical symptoms suggested of COVID. Actually, we only went to the 3rd single room. So there was absolutely 0 chance of infection because they were individual patients amongst, you know, straight patient to patient anyway. If you went to the real world, the 3.8 hours, you would have used the 4 single bays, and you would have used 2 of the 4-man bays, of which the highest number ever used was 3 in the 6th bay. Take it 6 hours, and you did have to put people in trolleys on the corridor. But compared to the lab-based testing, this is superb results, particularly on the left-hand side, because either for all the lab-based testing, all the bays filled and the overflow was being used. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're looking at potentially in worse scenarios like 40, 50 people in corridors. It will all be in the HTA monograph. Okay, so these are really hard to model, and you've got this green bit here that says QALYs do not capture any potential benefits of the quicker tests. So what, you know, we know this is happening, but we're assuming that no one gets, apart from the cross-contamination, no one else gets upset, annoyed, or gets bad treatment, which probably isn't true. These are just summary stats. I won't talk you through them, but we then talked about how many people were correctly told to isolate, how many were correctly told not to isolate, and how many were told to isolate when they shouldn't have done. So you could see across strategies, you've got a different profile. And that may be important for economic considerations, or if for anxiety, mental health reasons. I won't talk you through the asymptomatic staff testing results. Similar things were going on. Yeah. So we did quite a lot of sensitivity analyses. I won't read through them, but the chance of dying or needing ICU, that's a key one to do. And the costs of the point of care. Some of the manufacturers got very jumpy that we costed them higher than lab-based tests. And well, there was no price out there at that time. So that was another sensitivity analysis. Yeah, we also looked at test characteristics across different scenarios. These would be desirable, acceptable, and real world. But I don't really want to stop on the results. That there's just too many things coming through. But if you just scan down here, you can see we halved the infection rate, we doubled it, used pink bays, assuming the clinicians didn't override tests. There's lots of things we looked at. Less people turning up, failure rates, what happens if they increase, and hospital configurations. So we looked at all of these things, all of which gives you different ICEs, so in terms of cost per QALYs. So at the end of the work, we ended up saying there's considerable uncertainty, which of course we could have said from day one. But what we did, and here was the crucial bit, almost we don't care that much how correct the results are, as long as they're indicative, they're broadly right. But what we do have is a model that's already built if we need to test this quickly. And that was one of the things that the funders wanted. So if things have turned out really badly, I mean, I'm hoping we're on the upside of everything. If things turned out badly and we needed a model that could be changed almost overnight to run things, we had it. But key things, obviously, how quickly the point of care comes back with a result affects the overall results. The diagnostic accuracy affects the results, and so does how quickly the lab test comes back. I'm not going to go through these summaries. These were for the NICE committee. I've already talked to you about them. Yeah, the quality loss per additional infection obviously affected things, but the key thing was there was no blanket solution, but we are providing answers, or we're providing scenarios. And I even said, come to me and I'll run one for you bespoke just to see what's happening, to try and help people. Equality is very important, have to be dealt with by the NICE committee, but I'm skipping over it now. These were the things that the committee were asked to think about. I'll just leave that on the screen for a second. And that was the end of that talk. I'm going to go on to, there's about 3 more slides, which should put me bang on when I should finish. So this is the modelling viewpoint. So I don't know the audience, you know, how many of you are modelers and how many are not, but for the modelers, this work was done very quickly. It was less than 3 months to do the entire lot, which was pretty stressful. Although working on it meant I couldn't go out and actually catch COVID. That was the one plus of it. But we have this framework, and that can tell us, so I can test which parameters really matter and which don't. If I was to repopulate it now, I guess we'd be using a lot different parameters, but these were the best that we had in September 2020. From my perspective, everyone liked the model, so that was pleasing. The committee meeting was like a PhD viva. It was like transported back in time. It was 3 hours of constant questioning. The one thing that I didn't bring out was the acceptable TPP from the MRHA wasn't acceptable. It was terrible. The real world was much better. So MRHA had tried to really ratchet down, you know, you have to get it done within 2 hours and we're prepared to lose diagnostic accuracy. That was a bad trade-off. And from that, I've had chats with MRHA. So the work, the tests still haven't come out yet, really, to be put into the model, which is a shame because it might mean the work is set up, but it might not be really used in anger. But if COVID disappears, we'll all be happy. You wouldn't go to this level of complexity for most diagnostics. And I mentioned the last one. The one thing I wanted to end on was adapting the model. So once we had the structure set up, we all thought it would probably be fairly easy to switch settings because I'd already built the model, written the code, everything was set up. But actually, when I went to look at it for a care facility, it wasn't true at all. I had to almost rebuild it from scratch. So I talked a bit about the linearity of the hospital model with people coming in and almost on a conveyor belt leaving alive or dead. In a residential care facility, you've got this constant cycles of lockdowns, non-lockdowns coming out, residents cycling through the system, shared rooms, non-shared rooms, and actually it was more complicated, particularly when you look at strategies as do you release everyone from their isolation when the index case was shown to be negative, or there's many different scenarios you could look at. So that's the basis of another HTA monograph. Sorry, I didn't put the ref on there. But the key thing was everyone thought I'd be able to adapt it very quickly, and that wasn't the case. So almost perfect timing, hopefully.